want to go now to this issue. Despite all the Australian states voting against the voice, it's very clear that Labor's endgame is still a treaty. In fact, despite that wholesale rejection of treaty, there's still millions in the budget for the Makarrata process, and there's still a treaty unit inside the public service that still hasn't been disbanded. Now, the Prime Minister was asked about this yesterday. At first, he tried to sort of skirt around the question before being drawn back to this answer.
Will the Prime Minister honour his promise to deliver treaty and truth-telling?
Whilst these issues are very important, it is quite extraordinary that they're now going to go past 3 o'clock without asking a question about a $107 billion package. The Commonwealth certainly is not in any negotiations on treaty, and indeed treaty implies two sides negotiating and coming to an agreement. That's what occurs.
Tricky language again, just like we have no plans until he had the plan to change stage 3. We're not actually negotiating now, he says. Doesn't mean they're not preparing it, doesn't mean they've got the millions in the budget, doesn't mean they haven't got the unit down in the department, which they have. And today we learned the Productivity Commission's recommendation that powers in relation to health, education, safety, all get taken off the normal government departments that run our lives and handed over to a whole lot of Aboriginal community organisations. Joining me now for this and more, the Australian's foreign editor, Greg Sheridan. Greg, I know we're going to get into some defence matters in a moment, but you were a significant voice in the voice debate in the public domain. You listened to the Prime Minister, you listened to this stuff today about the Productivity Commission report, the fact that treaty is absolutely still on the table. It is like democracy doesn't matter.
Well, Peter, you're absolutely right. A couple of things strike me about this right from the get-go, so to speak. The first is this is a very deceptive, tricky and opaque government. In the area that I work in, you know, defence and, national security, it's very, very hard to get a straight answer from the government on anything. And foreign affairs a bit better. But does the Prime Minister really mean they're not doing anything about treaty? If that's the case, then why are the millions of dollars still in the budget? And this Productivity Commission idea that you just hand money over to a local community to administer a health budget or something, well, that's just kind of crackers, really. Obviously, you want to have very effective consultation, and particular communities may have particular needs. You know, obviously, we should have listened attentively to those Aboriginal women leaders who were saying the grog bans were essential to the chance of them, surviving alive, some of their numbers, some women and some girls surviving physically. But the idea that you just, you set up a special, you just hand money over, that there's no suggestion that that would work. I mean, I live in a local government area in Melbourne. If you gave us the money to run our own health service, we'd make a colossal mess of it. What's been going on has been ineffective, but the Productivity Commission claiming consultation has only been token. Well, what does that say about all the existing consultative bodies in the Aboriginal industry, which consumes billions of dollars a year, if they've only managed to have token consultation? The whole thing just doesn't make any sense, really.
And of course, if they were honourable, all of these Aboriginal corporations would spill their boards, would sack their staff to say, we've had all these millions and billions, we haven't achieved the outcomes, we've got to wear some of that blame. But they don't. They just want to grow it. They don't want to sort of get back to basics. And, put your foreign affairs hat on, we can see what's happening in New Zealand. They've gone down the path of co-governance broadly by stealth under successive Labor governments. It was a big debating point in the recent election there. The new coalition, of course, led by the centre-right Nationals, they want to wind back some of these pro-Maori sort of anti-New Zealander changes. As I said, the community supports them, but the activists don't, do they?
No, you're dead right, Peter. I hope the New Zealand government has the courage of conviction and pushes through with this. But it shows how poisonous it is if you put race at the heart of politics and governance. You don't get racial harmony out of that. You get endless racial conflict. Now, a friend of mine who lived for a long time in New Zealand said to me that New Zealand went from being 20 or 30 years ago a successful multicultural society to being today an unsuccessful and often quite bitter biracial society. And all of this idea of co-governance rests on the proposition that Maori and other New Zealander are sort of irreconcilable. They're not part of the one community, and therefore you have to have a negotiation over everything between Maori leadership and, you know, other New Zealand leadership. But what that means, of course, is that citizenship is not universal. Some people have different rights, and you know, the Maori community doesn't exercise democracy within its own community. And once you've set up institutions based on that, I mean, in Australia, a lot of the Aboriginal grievance industry wouldn't exist if it hadn't been funded so lavishly by government, by taxpayers. But once, as with New Zealand, you set up institutions like that, trying to pull them back provokes a lot of conflict, because you're trying to take money and power off people who have suddenly got money and power. But New Zealand should be a cautionary tale. We dodged a bullet by voting no to the voice. But this plague of identity politics, the left all over the Western world is trying to impose this, and they'll keep trying to impose it in Australia as well.
Well, let's go to defence. That terrific column you wrote yesterday, you're talking about the paralysis we're seeing inside the Defence Department. You point out that there's just, remember the Noodle Nation all those years ago, that diagram that sunk the Labor government at the time. I mean, this is a Noodle Nation down there in defence. We don't know who's in charge. Any wonder we've got all these problems? I mean, we have to rent Black Hawks at the moment from overseas because we've got no birds to put in the air for our own troops. Take us through your concerns. Well,
Peter, the Albanese government is now, you know, past the halfway mark of its first term, and it's done absolutely nothing in defence. And one reason is because it has very weak ministerial leadership in defence. If you look back at it, all the really good defence weapons purchases in recent decades have come from individual defence ministers. I mean, Christopher Pyne, God bless him for all his sins, you know, he was responsible for the Ghost Bats. Brendan Nelson was responsible for the Super Hornets. Stephen Smith, although he ran the defence budget down, was responsible for the Growlers. These were ministers exerting control over a department which is very slow at the best of times. But, you know, in the previous coalition government, you had a very high turnover of defence ministers, so no one established control. And now under Labor, you've got what I think is the most bizarre ministerial arrangements I've ever seen in 45 years of journalism. You've got the Defence Minister presiding over the most complex and demanding portfolio in government, and he's a part-timer. He's also the Deputy Prime Minister, which means whenever Albanese is away, which is a lot, he's the acting Prime Minister. He's supposed to take a big role in domestic issues. Kim Beazley, who knew a million times more about defence than Richard Marles will ever know, couldn't do anything but defence when he was Defence Minister. It fully absorbed him and it fully exhausted him. But Marles is a part-timer. And then in the adjacent portfolio, defence industry, which is responsible for hundreds of billions of dollars of projects. I mean, Marles is not good on detail about equipment. He sometimes says that about himself, and he defers to Pat Conroy, the Defence Industry Minister. But Pat Conroy is a junior minister outside Cabinet with a junior minister's staff allocation, and he has another portfolio, Pacific Affairs. So his staffers come from DFAT, and they divide their time 50% onto the Pacific. So defence industry, which is normally a full Cabinet position in itself, is run by a half-time junior minister with a half-time junior minister staff allocation. So Defence is delighted about all this because it means there's no ministerial leadership and no supervision. They just continue to run themselves, and they run themselves unbelievably badly. As I've often expressed the view, I don't think there is another nation in the world that spends its defence dollar as inefficiently as Australia does.
Worst ministerial arrangements in 40 years of journalism. Greg Sheridan, that is a damning assessment. Thank you for your time.